know, when we took our quick break, I noticed one of the quotes, and I wanted to comment on that and then ask you a question, okay? The idea that people to whom nothing has ever happened cannot understand the unimportance of events. And it occurred to me that I know that people I've worked with who have felt a sense of imminent death, when they survive, seem to have a different view of the world and a different perspective. And I wondered if that might be true with post-traumatic stress people as well.
Yes, I believe it is. The ones I've dealt with, I've observed that phenomenon.
Okay.
But it also tends to happen that when you're suffering the effects of the stress disorder and reliving the event, you get a sense of foreshortened life, impending doom, if you will. Something terrible is going to happen. Obviously, you're not going to live very long. And the other symptom I've encountered quite frequently is what is sometimes called survivor's guilt. If there were a group of people went through it together and they were destroyed somehow and you weren't, the question of why was I picked, what's different, see, now you've made yourself different from the rest of the world again. And that's a hard thing to deal with. We want to feel some commonality. And a major trauma tends to destroy that.
Well, and that idea of trying to make sense out of
things that
trauma. I mean, the fact that it's trauma tells us that
it doesn't make sense.
That's right.
Right.
That's
and at
right.
least you probably have no control over it.
Yeah. Do you think that's one of the hardest parts for people?
I think so. The fact that the universe seems to be against you and something terrible has happened that you didn't deserve, and why did it happen to me? And it is out of my control, and I'm overwhelmed, and I'm being demolished here. So you feel insignificant, unsure of yourself.
Okay.
And so you try to avoid all the reminders of that you can.
It would seem to me, too, that people go through a period of self-blame, even though it isn't rational, in the sense that, you know, I experienced an earthquake, but somehow, well, I should have known, or I should have taken better care of the house, or I should have.
Sure. Particularly if it involves the death of a loved one, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And your first reaction is, what could I have done differently? How could I have prevented this? And where did I fail? And you begin to beat yourself up and effectively add to the trauma.
Okay. Yeah, so it's almost like we re-victimize ourselves with our own our own
Because
voice.
obviously there's something wrong with us.
Yeah, or it wouldn't have happened like that.
Right.
Well, and in some ways it's comforting in the sense that I know working with abused children and adults who've been abused as children, one of the comforts that they had during the abuse was to somehow believe it was their fault, because if it was their fault, then they could change it. To have to acknowledge that mommy and daddy are being abusive to me because they are out of control is to acknowledge my actual helplessness. And I think for a lot of us, that helplessness is actually what's the most frightening.
And there's also an age where you do believe that whatever is happening, you made happen.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get out of that belief when the traumas happen very young.
Yeah.
Okay. And the ones that I found the most difficult to deal with and yet the most straightforward are the ones where there was serious abuse over a prolonged period of time.
Yeah. That's, I had made reference to that. I know Timon Cermak did some postdoctoral work at the VA and began to see a lot of similarities between his veterans and the adult children of alcoholics he was working with.
Absolutely.
And as he did that, began to look at the results of, as you said, cumulative, long-term, prolonged stress.
And the clue is that the trauma has to be perceived as life-threatening. Somebody else looking at it may not perceive it that way.
Okay.
But if you've got a drunken parent come roaring down the hall at 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't know that he's not going to destroy you if you're particularly young.
Yeah.
And so that's a very intense trauma. And as a result, if he was a male offender, then you avoid contact with males, because that's one of the main triggers.
Yeah. Yeah, that would make sense. Or to be in a position where you were so much in control of every situation that nobody around you could do something.
Could get out of line, therefore you were safe.
Yeah.
And we all operate under the mistaken premise that if we're in control of the situation, it's going to work better.
That's a mistake.
You betcha. You betcha.
Oh, horrifying. Okay.
I've learned to let go and relax.
Good for you. So part of that kind of long-term low-grade stress, I guess at some level would be harder for somebody to recognize in a way than you know, it's if I had this thing I could at least say happened to me.
Yes, or I'm having a reaction, I don't know what it's from, and you ask them about their childhood, and they say, oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
Because it was normal for them. And not until they could begin to compare it with how other people lived do they realize what the impact was on them.
Sure.
Okay, so, and the ones I've seen who indulge in compulsive behavior and addiction are really anesthetizing themselves. They're self-medicating.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, part of that fear of experiencing it, you know, I know in my work what I've noticed and experienced even individually is that because that memory is made maybe as a child, if you go back and experience that memory, you forget that you're an adult experiencing it. You know, one of the things I work with people as well, yes, but you are now an adult with an adult tool. So if you remember that,
it
doesn't mean that you're 7 again.
But when we experience it, we age regress, and we literally internally become the child we were when the memory was formed.
Yeah.
And so what I do with my clients in hypnosis is have them go up and reprogram by introducing adult information into the child's program, in effect, which is similar to what you're doing, but I call it a reprogramming and tell them what they're doing. It has words like healing the wounded inner child, which some people talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's part of what we have to do. And the treatment, often, I tend to treat it almost like a phobia. If you're avoiding things, if you're having stress, anxiety type reactions, the behavioral technique is the flooding or the desensitization. And you can either do it by actual exposure, or what I found to be far more cost effective is good hypnosis, where once you get the imagery established in the mind doesn't really care whether it's coming from the external sensors or not. Okay, so you can also graduate it so that they can first observe the incident rather than being in it, and move closer and closer and closer until they can participate in it and not be overwhelmed by it anymore. Okay.
Which gives them a sense of power.
Sense of power. You're empowering them.
And that's, I'm sure that must be key.
It is.
To sort of respond to that helplessness that was there at the time.
And I try to give people the knowledge that they're creating their internal reality. They're scripting and writing the script for everything that happens. And if you don't like the script, rewrite it.
I know, I think often we feel like we're sort of products, or our childhood creates an inevitability in simply the way we are.
Well, it brought us to where we are, but it's not inevitable.
Okay. So with post-traumatic stress, one of the treatments of choice is hypnosis. Do you find that group therapy is helpful for people with post-traumatic stress disorder?
Depending upon the trauma for children molested, I recommend AMAC groups. Or adults molested as children. Chemically dependent people, of course, you go through the 12-step programs. If it's a death, some of the support groups, the dying support organization, Center for Living with Dying is one I refer to frequently. And there are support groups out there. Like I said earlier about the veterans, if you can be with peers who've suffered through a similar event, there's a normalizing and a healing process that can take place. It'd be a supportive. Because otherwise you'll talk to people and they won't understand what you're talking about.
Which then increases the isolation that you're talking about.
Increases the isolation and makes the symptoms worse. So that's what my job as a therapist is to, I believe, go into their reality and understand what they're talking about.
How about the, I know one of the symptoms here was nightmares. I've certainly had clients in the process of therapy may not have them as a presenting problem, but as they continue with therapy, begin to have nightmares.
Right.
And is that something also amenable to hypnosis? Or?
I believe so. I also try to reframe it for the client and say, okay, we've touched memories that you haven't dealt with before, and in your dreams you're processing those memories. So the nightmares are actually a constructive thing if you look at them that way and not be afraid of them. And deal with them, and it tends to soften them. We can also, if they are very responsive to hypnosis, literally make them go away. And it's easier with children, to give them some sense of empowerment. So I have one young boy I've worked with where I gave him the very strong story that he was in charge of his dreams. And if a dream was happening that he didn't like, he was to stop it and change it and redirect it. And he found out he could do that. he happened to be a very responsive case.
Yeah.
I also gave him a guardian with a big sword standing over his bed that would protect him.
Good
okay?
for you.
And so we can do the similar things with adults. A sense of empowerment and protecting themselves and not being afraid of the memory.
Okay.
Because the memory can't do us any more harm unless we let it do so.
That's a good point. And I imagine it's an important thing to keep in mind because it feels so real, feels
Yes.
so immediate.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Now, I understand one of the other effective treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder is the retelling of the trauma. I mean, and you know, I've certainly had clients say, well, I don't want to talk about it because talking about it is going to make it come back or is going to make me remember. I don't know about that. I mean, my sense of it is people seem to need to play that out.
Need to release. I've convinced most of my clients, because I believe it's true, that the fear of what will happen is worse than what will happen. Okay? And if you go back and share the memory with someone else, the fact that you can get it out and talk about it and have somebody listen to it and believe you makes you feel less different. And now it's off your chest. It's no longer a secret that you're guarding, like in so many cases it is, like a molest.
Yeah. Well, but you know, one of the things I know I've had clients say to me is, if the nature of their trauma is particularly horrifying or violent, the other dilemma they have is, even if they're willing to talk about it, people around them don't want to hear it.
That's true.
Because it's so hard to listen to.
That's why it helps to have a support group or a qualified therapist.
Yeah. Because the nature of some of what needs to be said is outside usual experience for people, and it might be harder to hear.
And you may harder to hear, and you may need some help interpreting what it means and what it looks like.
I don't understand.
Well, each of us interprets our own way, and if you can normalize it and say, okay, it's okay to have that kind of a reaction. That's your defense mechanism working, and that's good. Now let's see what we can do to no longer have to apply it to today's events.
Okay.
I always authenticate the defense mechanism they adopted, but then point out that it was designed for what was happening then. It's out of date, it's obsolete for what's happening now, so we need a different approach.
Okay, so in general, helping people eventually move things back to their place and time and separate them from what's going on in their life right now. We're going to need to close. I want to thank you for coming back and sharing more with us.
Okay.
Thank you for coming. Join us in the upcoming weeks as we explore relationships and adoption search. I'm Mary Crocker Cook. Good night. Done.